with public engagement and the idea of practicable democracy is to try to pull together a really large and diverse body of literature in communication, rhetoric, political science, philosophy, quantitative, qualitative, humanistic, etc., in order to try to do something to reconfigure the way that we think about engagement and on some of the premises about democracy that tend to inform engagement practices. Now, the more specific task in relationship to this grant is to build a series of engagement events on nanotechnology, both online and in 3 or 4 United States cities, to collect data on participants' perceptions of nanotechnology's risks and their methods of collectively forming those opinions, which includes what kind of information inputs are going into them and so on. What I want to talk about for about the next 30 minutes are 4 elements that inform the ways that I'm thinking about the organization of these engagement events. First is what I see as a problem. That existing engagement models seem fundamentally, by design and philosophy, ill-suited to this task. Second, some sort of alternative foundation then for engagement. And a proposed shift here, I believe, from idealist democracy to what I've termed practicable democracy, and it's my term, so you probably won't find any literature on it, but I'll get something in print very soon, I promise, as a philosophy and approach to doing engagement. So what would practicable democracy engagement look like? I don't want to just sort of lay out the ideals of it, but rather to actually talk about the contours and guidelines for building and conducting practicable democracy engagement events. And finally, how that relates to the idea of collecting the kind of data we're talking about collecting. If the idea of doing engagement events is in part so that we have data about these kinds of influences and interactions, then that should have some influence over how the engagement events take place. So I'll try to stick to about 30 minutes and just cover these 4 elements that I've outlined here. Let me start, though, by backing up to the origins and foundations of common civic engagement models, which really come from part of the deliberative democracy movement. Now, the deliberative democracy movement has a very long history, even though a lot of people who write in it don't recognize kind of the full length of the history. It's usually tied to movements that occurred in Europe over the last 40 years. But really, in this country, we can go back to the 19-teens and 1920s and some of the civic education programs and the discussion movement and the forum movement that took place both within university systems and within the federal government. William Keith, by the way, out at Wisconsin-Milwaukee, has a fantastic book that traces out some of this stuff. It was and continues to be an activist movement. It is a social movement to enhance democracy. That is its objective. Make democracy more functional, better, more democratic, etc. It also seeks to be inclusive. It wants broad participation of the whole of the citizenry. This was even true of the discussion and forum movements in the teens and 20s, which sought to be multiracial, which sought to be open to women, even in areas where it was particularly unpopular to do so, and they were required to segregate. So in the teens and 20s, they held engagement events both for African Americans and for whites, but they had to hold them separately in some communities where they refused to allow them to be held together. Today, the broad participation of the whole citizenry is vital to the ways that most people think about deliberative democracy. And finally, it's transformative. Its goal is to change how political discourse and political decisions occur. That being said, then, how does it come to these? What are the assumptions behind it that bring it to those? And those are really grounded in certain neo-Kantian and idealist philosophies, such as those of Rawls and Habermas. It's nothing particularly wrong. It just orients it in a particular way and towards these particular goals. First thing to understand, it is grounded in a speculative ideal. The premise is, and you can see this in people like Gutman and Thompson, but certainly you can go back to Rawls and Habermas and read this. The premise is that you start with a theorization of what ideal democracy and ideal communication within that democracy looks like. So it starts with the idea of a speculative world. What would the ideal world of politics and discourse look like? That then becomes the normative standard. So it's counterfactual. It starts from a fundamental counterfactual concept of what the ideal space should look like, then sets that up as a normative ideal, and that is the standard that we should strive to achieve. Finally, then, it is theory-driven by that speculative and normative ideal. What I mean is theory drives the interpretation of data. Data has no impact on the ideal state of the theory. Every incident in which the speculative ideal fails to occur is more evidence of the exigence and need to strive harder for the speculative ideal. every case in which society falls short of it is just more evidence of why we need it. It's a very tight ideological package, works very well, has really strong contours in terms of democracy promotion, and as a theory is really tightly argued. Button and Reif point this out really well in their discussion of this. Qualities then of ideal political conditions in deliberative democracy include the following. It's supposed to be rational. Decisions are made by reasoned and evidence discussion as much as possible, particularly public reasons. And this is a really big element of what comes out in this, that people aren't supposed to ground decisions in their private motivations or private reasons, but in reasons which can be shared amongst their fellow deliberators in public. It's supposed to be fair. Everyone is supposed to have equal voice and equal power. This also includes equality of capacity, which means not only are we talking about equality of capital like economic capital, but elements of social and cultural capital really have to have a rough parity or equality in order for fairness to work within a deliberative space. If you have some people who are significantly better informed, some people who are significantly more rhetorically skilled, it produces problems of fairness within the ideal political space. And finally, it builds upon commonalities. You have to have, Habermas argued, a basic background political culture of commonalities in order for it to function well. The motivations behind this largely appeal to concerns about elite and technocratic forms of governments, the capacity to manage democratic institutions in particularly non-democratic ways. So ideally, civic engagement along deliberative democracy is supposed to empower people, to involve lay citizens even in highly technical matters. It's supposed to offset special interests, check the drives of industry and special interests with public feedback by broad participation. And finally, it's supposed to demystify some of the technologies in some regards. It can make, of course, in this application, even nanotech accessible. So you can see the ways that this relates to some of the concerns about nanotechnology governments, new emerging technology governance, and how it ties into some basic normative ideals in the United States and even more so, I think, in Western Europe to become incredibly appealing. In terms of the form this takes, along specific models that have been used in the United States, I've outlined 4 of the specific models, and I just want to point out some of the elements that tie to these ideological and philosophical assumptions behind the application more clearly along these 4 models. I'm going to outline these 4 models on the basis of some of who I consider to be the thinkers that are at the core of thinking about each model. So for citizen panels, which are also called citizen juries, but panels the more generic term, juries the trademark term, Crosby and Nethercutt are the people I'll rely on here. For consensus conferences, it's Hendricks. For national issues forums, it's Melville, Willingham, and Dedrick. And for deliberative polling, it is, of course, Fishkin, along with Ackerman and Farrar. First thing is, you want representative sampling, diverse sampling, or totally open forums. Broad participation of as much of the public as possible is done in a very deliberative way by representative sampling of individuals, and it's focused upon representation of individuals as they relate to a particular studied population. Consensus conferences don't tend to worry about representative so much, but they do tend to worry about diversity. Of course, these things vary along particular applications people deploy. And then the national issue forums have few or no limits in sampling. They tend to be open self-selection kinds of events. So there's the idea of inclusion that we see in the philosophy. In all 4 elements, we have a conscious choice about the selection of information which produces what is perceived to be a more ideal or better body of information going into the public decision makings. So representation by specialists and experts, usually with direct access between the public and the experts. Q&As after the expert presentations are common in most of these formats. In cases in which experts are not brought in, NIFs, by the way, are the least interventionist of all of these models. They prepare carefully balanced briefing booklets in the NIFs, which are done at the national level and then distributed to the local sites where they hold the national issue forums. So here we want optimal information going in is the idea, and high degrees of artificiality in the construction and dissemination of that information. Finally, you want an ideal communicative space. There's an awareness here that we have a problem in terms of deliberation, that people don't tend to deliberate terribly well. So in most cases, you have a deliberative process that in some way or another has been guided, shaped, or managed around those ideals of ideal participation and deliberation. Many hours of deliberation in some of these formats. Advisors that